The siege of Myitkyina officially ended on August 3, 1944, but the conclusion existed only on paper. The fighting had ceased in the technical sense. No more coordinated Japanese resistance, no further counterattacks, no artillery falling on the airstrip, but nothing about the environment reflected resolution. The town remained shattered into sections of rubble, burned timber, and collapsed earthworks. The jungle pressed in from every direction, reclaiming trenches almost as quickly as they were abandoned. Rain fell daily, sometimes in sheets, sometimes as a constant damp presence that never fully lifted. The air smelled of rot, cordite, wet canvas, and human waste. For the men and women tasked with medical care, the end of the siege marked the beginning of a different kind of strain, one that was quieter, more prolonged, and less visible to command reports. Myitkyina mattered because it was an airfield first and a town second. Control of the strip allowed Allied aircraft to resupply Chinese forces and extend air operations deeper into Japanese-held territory. That strategic value justified the cost. What it did not account for was what happened afterward. The battle had been fought in extreme conditions. Tropical heat, monsoon rains, limited supplies, and constant disease. By the time Japanese resistance collapsed, the medical system supporting the Allied forces was already operating beyond its intended capacity. Casualties had accumulated faster than evacuation routes could clear them. Many wounds had gone untreated for days before men reached aid stations. Others arrived infected, septic, or already beyond recovery. Combat had ended, but the human damage was still unfolding. Among the British units assigned to the area was an Indian infantry formation supported by Royal Army Medical Corps personnel. One of those medics kept a small diary, no larger than his palm, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the rain out. He did not record tactics or movements. He wrote about bodies, about time, about exhaustion. His entries from early August shift noticeably in tone. During the siege, his writing had been clipped and functional, numbers of wounded, types of injuries, shortages of morphine, bandages, clean water. After the siege, the sentences lengthened. The pace slowed. He began recording things that did not appear on casualty lists. Men who survived their wounds but died days later from infection. Soldiers who asked the same questions repeatedly as fever set in. Stretcher bearers who collapsed while carrying others. He noted that the most dangerous period was no longer during attacks, but afterward, when the body had time to fail. Less than 2 miles from the airstrip, an American field hospital operated out of tents and hastily reinforced structures. Army nurses rotated through shifts that blurred into one another. One of them, assigned to surgical recovery and later infectious wards, wrote letters home to her sister in the Midwest. The letters were censored, but the omissions are as revealing as the text. She could not name the location. She could not describe operations in detail. She could not mention casualty numbers. What she could write about were smells, weather, and routine. She described how bandages never fully dried, how uniforms returned to the ward already damp from the humidity, how patients slept in short intervals, waking frequently in confusion. She wrote that the sound of aircraft overhead no longer brought relief, because each landing meant more work, more blood, more triage decisions that could not be reversed. Both the diary and the letters converge on the same realization, that the siege had not ended suffering, it had redistributed it. The front line dissolved, but its effects moved inward, into tents and wards and improvised operating spaces. The medic wrote about treating men who had survived multiple engagements only to succumb to dysentery or malaria weeks later. The nurse wrote about amputations performed too late to save lives, not because surgeons lacked skill, but because evacuation delays had allowed infection to spread. Neither framed these outcomes as tragedy. They described them as expected. The war, in this phase, was not dramatic. It was administrative. It was procedural. It was relentless. Myitkyina after the siege became a place defined by waiting. Waiting for supplies. Waiting for transport. Waiting for wounds to declare themselves survivable or fatal. The British medic noted that morale among the wounded was uneven. Some men, relieved to be alive, spoke about going home or being transferred. Others seemed to understand that survival in Burma did not guarantee survival afterward. The American nurse observed a similar division. She wrote that some patients asked for letters to be written for them, even when their condition was stable, as if they sensed that stability was temporary. Others avoided conversation entirely, staring upward through tent flaps at rain-soaked canvas. Neither writer described the Japanese enemy after the siege. There were no triumphs recorded, no reflections on victory. Instead, both focused inward on the human cost that continued without enemy action. The medic recorded that Japanese wounded captured during the final days of fighting were treated alongside Allied casualties, often in worse condition due to prolonged lack of care. He noted the silence of those prisoners, their refusal of food in some cases, and the difficulty of communication. The nurse mentioned treating men whose uniforms were indistinguishable once blood and mud were washed away. She did not specify nationality. She wrote only that wounds looked the same, regardless of who wore them. By mid-August, Myakina was technically secure. Flights increased. Command attention shifted forward. Yet the medical burden remained concentrated in place. The siege had ended, but its residue lingered in bodies that failed slowly, in systems stretched thin, and in caregivers whose work had lost any sense of progression. The diary and the letters do not suggest despair. They suggest something more controlled and more troubling. Adaptation. The acceptance that this was now the shape of the war. Not motion but aftermath. Not advanced but accounting. By the second week after the siege, Myakina had entered a phase the British medic described as administrative suffering. The artillery had stopped. The gunfire was gone. Yet the flow of casualties did not slow, it changed character. The injuries arriving at aid stations were no longer fresh shrapnel wounds or bullet strikes sustained during assaults. They were complications. Infections that had spread quietly beneath bandages. Fevers that no longer responded to quinine. Surgical wounds that reopened under constant humidity. Men who had walked unaided days earlier were now carried delirious, dehydrated, their skin gray, their pulse shallow. The medic wrote that the jungle did not need combat to kill. It only needed time. The first outbreaks were gastrointestinal. Dysentery moved through units faster than orders could track it. Water purification systems failed intermittently, not from sabotage, but from exhaustion. Filters clogged, fuel ran out, equipment broke and replacements were slow to arrive. The medic recorded treating entire sections of men unable to stand without assistance, their bodies emptied by days of illness. He noted that the most dangerous cases were not those who collapsed quickly, but those who tried to continue working through symptoms. By the time they reached care, their condition was often irreversible. The war had taught them to endure. Now endurance was killing them. At the American Field Hospital, the nurse's letters shift in rhythm. Her sentences become shorter, more repetitive. She describes days that began without clear distinction from the day before. The wards remained full even as some patients were evacuated by air. Each departure created space that filled within hours. She wrote that triage after the siege became more difficult, not less. During combat, urgency was obvious. Afterward, every case seemed urgent, and resources were no longer allocated by proximity to the front, but by probability of survival. She described surgeons making decisions based not on bravery or service record, but on likelihood, who might live if operated on now, who might not survive even with intervention. Those judgments were rarely spoken aloud. The diary records a growing shortage of medical personnel themselves. Stretcher bearers fell ill. Orderlies collapsed from exhaustion. Medics who had worked without sleep during the siege now found their hands shaking during routine procedures. The British medic noted that mistakes increased, not from incompetence, but from cumulative fatigue. A miscounted dosage, a delayed dressing change, patient left too long without observation. None of these errors would have mattered in isolation. In aggregate, they became fatal. He wrote that the war after Myakina was less about treating wounds and more about managing failure, human, mechanical, and logistical. Malaria followed, then scrub typhus, then infections whose causes could not be immediately identified. The medic's entries described fevers that rose sharply at night and broke by morning, only to return stronger the next day. He wrote about men hallucinating quietly, speaking to people who were not present, or reliving earlier battles with precise detail. These cases were not dramatic. There were no screams. Most patients drifted in and out of awareness, their decline marked by paperwork rather than noise. The nurse described sitting beside patients during the early hours before dawn, when the heat eased slightly and the generators hummed steadily, watching breathing patterns change in increments too small to measure but impossible to ignore. Both writers note a subtle but critical shift in morale, not among combat troops, but among caregivers. During the siege, there had been a sense of purpose rooted in immediacy. Each action felt connected to survival. Afterward, the connection frayed. The British medic wrote that saving a life no longer felt like altering the course of anything. The war continued elsewhere. Units rotated forward. New fronts opened. Here, in Myitkyina, the work felt static. Necessary, but detached from momentum. He wrote that this was harder to endure than danger. Danger was finite. This was indefinite. The American nurse echoed this sentiment without naming it. In one letter, she described packing and unpacking the same medical crates repeatedly as wards were rearranged to accommodate different outbreaks. She wrote about learning to recognize the sound of approaching rain by pressure changes alone. She mentioned that she had stopped trying to remember how many days she had been in the same clothes. None of these details were dramatic, but together they formed a picture of erosion. Not collapse, but wear. Japanese prisoners and wounded continued to arrive sporadically, brought in from jungle positions uncovered during post-siege sweeps. The medic wrote that many were skeletal, their wounds days or weeks old. Some refused treatment initially. Others accepted it without expression. Communication was minimal. Treatment was not. He noted that the presence of these prisoners created tension among Allied wounded, not out of hostility, but confusion. The war had shifted categories. Enemies and allies occupied the same space, subject to the same infections, the same shortages, the same outcome probabilities. The nurse wrote that uniforms mattered less after the siege. Everyone smelled the same. Everyone bled the same. Everyone waited. As August progressed, command attention moved away from Myitkyina. Reports focused on forward advances. The siege became a completed operation. The medical burden remained behind, largely invisible to those planning subsequent movements. Supplies improved incrementally, but not enough to reverse the damage already done. The diary notes that men who would have survived under different conditions were now being lost to preventable complications. The nurse wrote that this knowledge did not produce anger. Produced resignation. The system was not cruel. It was insufficient. By late August, both writers describe a change in themselves. The medic wrote that he had begun recording names less frequently, relying instead on numbers and categories. The nurse wrote that she stopped rereading her letters before sending them. Precision gave way to function. Emotion was not suppressed, it was deprioritized. The work required it. Myitkyina, after the siege, became a place where survival was negotiated daily, not with the enemy, but with environment, logistics, and time. The diary and the letters do not frame this period as exceptional. They treat it as normal. That, more than any casualty count, explains what the siege truly cost. As September settled over northern Burma, the work at Myitkyina no longer followed any clear cycle of escalation or relief. It flattened. Days were measured not by events, but by absence, no major offensives, no decisive evacuations, no sudden improvements. The British medic noted that the silence after the siege was more oppressive than the bombardment had been. During combat, sound imposed structure. Afterward, the quiet allowed thoughts to accumulate without interruption. Men lay awake at night listening to insects, rain striking corrugated metal, distant aircraft engines that never landed. The medic wrote that this was when memory became dangerous. Without immediate tasks, recollections intruded. Faces of men lost earlier in the campaign, moments when a decision had gone one way instead of another. He began shortening his entries, not because less was happening, but because writing no longer brought clarity. The American nurse's letters reflect a similar contraction. Early correspondence had described people, scenes, and individual acts of care. By September, her writing focused on processes. intake numbers, bed rotations, sanitation schedules. She wrote about the importance of boiling instruments longer than regulations required, because contamination seemed to persist regardless. She wrote about learning to detect infection by smell before symptoms appeared. These observations were clinical, almost detached, but beneath them ran an unspoken adjustment. Emotional proximity had become unsustainable. The volume of suffering no longer allowed for individual absorption. To continue functioning, attention narrowed. Both writers describe a subtle redefinition of success. During the siege, success meant stabilization, keeping a wounded man alive long enough for evacuation. Afterward, success became less visible, preventing deterioration, slowing infection, buying hours instead of days. The medic wrote that he stopped expecting recovery. His goal shifted to delay. Delay death long enough for circumstances to change, even if they never did. This recalibration was not announced. It happened quietly, instinctively, as a means of survival for those providing care. Morale among patients declined unevenly. Some men, relieved to be out of combat, regained strength quickly once removed from immediate danger. Others collapsed only after the siege ended, as if the body had been sustaining itself on momentum alone. The medic described men who survived weeks of frontline exposure only to succumb to fever once they were finally at rest. He noted that the body seemed to choose when to fail. The nurse described similar cases, soldiers who spoke optimistically about returning home, then deteriorated rapidly overnight. There were no dramatic reversals, just quiet disappearances from the ward roster. Rain intensified during this period. Monsoon patterns disrupted supply routes, delayed evacuations, and saturated encampments. The medic wrote about dressings that would not stay dry, wounds that reopened despite repeated care. He noted that the jungle seemed indifferent to effort. No amount of discipline or procedure could fully counteract the environment. The nurse echoed this frustration in her letters, describing how equipment rusted faster than it could be cleaned, how bedding absorbed moisture and never fully dried. Comfort became an abstraction. Cleanliness is a moving target. Japanese wounded continued to arrive intermittently, often in worse condition than Allied casualties. Many had survived weeks without treatment. Some were brought in unconscious. Others arrived alert but severely malnourished. The medic wrote that treating them required a deliberate suspension of judgment. Not because of moral uncertainty, but because resentment served no purpose. Resources were already strained. Hatred did not improve outcomes. The nurse described tending to a Japanese soldier with a leg wound that had gone septic. She did not mention his rank or unit, only that he thanked her in broken English before losing consciousness. The moment is recorded without commentary. The significance lies in its ordinariness. As weeks passed, documentation itself began to fail. The medic admitted that he skipped days in his diary. Not intentionally, but because exhaustion blurred time. He wrote entries after the fact, reconstructing events from memory rather than immediacy. Accuracy suffered. Details merged. He noted this with concern, then stopped noting it at all. The nurse's letters, too, became less frequent. She wrote that there were nights when she fell asleep before finishing a page, waking to find the paper creased and damp from humidity. Some letters were never sent. She did not explain why. Command attention remained focused elsewhere. Myitkyina had achieved its strategic purpose. The airfield functioned. Supplies moved through. The cost of holding it was no longer discussed in daily briefings. The medic wrote that this invisibility weighed on him more than direct orders ever had. The war measured success geographically. Human cost was tallied elsewhere later, if at all. The nurse described overhearing conversations among officers discussing future operations while standing beside men who would not live to see them. There was no malice in this. Only prioritization. The psychological effect on caregivers was cumulative. The medic described moments of detachment that frightened him. Times when a patient's death registered as a logistical adjustment rather than a loss. He wrote that this reaction did not feel like callousness. Felt like preservation. The nurse wrote of similar sensations, recognizing when grief no longer rose automatically, when empathy required conscious effort. She did not frame this as failure. She framed it as an adaptation. By late September, the casualty flow finally began to diminish. Not because conditions improved, but because the pool of vulnerable men had been exhausted. Those who could recover had done so. Those who could not were gone. The wards slowly emptied, leaving behind a different kind of absence. The medic wrote that the quiet at this stage felt unnatural, as if something essential had been removed. The nurse wrote that she found herself missing the constant movement, not because it was desirable, but because it had given structure to endurance. Neither writer described relief when reassignment orders eventually came. Only transition. The medic noted that leaving Myakina felt less like departure and more like abandonment, of patience, of routines, of a place that had consumed months of attention and left permanent impressions. The nurse wrote that she folded her remaining letters and packed them without rereading. She would process the experience later, she assumed. There was no time now. What emerges from these records is not a narrative of heroism or resolution. It is a portrait of the aftermath, of individuals navigating a phase of war that receives little attention because it lacks spectacle. The siege of Myakina did not end when resistance collapsed. It lingered in bodies, in routines, in the slow erosion of those tasked with mending what combat had broken. The diary and the letters do not argue this point. They simply record it. And in doing so, they preserve a version of the war that did not end with victory, but with endurance stretched thin. The evacuation orders arrived without ceremony. No speeches, no acknowledgments of duration or cost. Just names, times, and destinations typed onto thin paper already soft from humidity. The British medic recorded the moment tersely. He noted the date, the unit designation, and the instruction to prepare selected patients for movement within 48 hours. There was no space in the entry for reaction. Preparation itself consumed everything. Wounds had to be stabilized just enough to survive transport. Fevers brought down temporarily. Morphine rationed carefully, not for comfort but for endurance. The nurse's letters from this period describe the same compression of emotion. She wrote that evacuation days felt unlike combat days. There was no adrenaline, only calculation. Each patient represented a risk that could not be eliminated, only managed. The physical act of evacuation revealed how provisional recovery had been. Men who could walk days earlier now collapsed under their own weight when lifted onto stretchers. The medic wrote that the transition from bed to transport was often the most dangerous phase of treatment. Bodies adapted to stillness. Movement reintroduced shock. The nurse described how hands gripped uniforms, bed frames, sleeves, any solid object, as patients were transferred. Some asked where they were going. Others did not ask anything at all. Silence, she noted, usually meant they already understood. Air evacuation dominated the process. The airfield at Myakina, the very objective that justified the siege, now functioned as a funnel through which the consequences of the campaign were removed from sight. The medic described the C-47 aircraft as loud, hot, and unforgiving. Stretchers were stacked in tiers. Ventilation was minimal. There was no room for error or adjustment once airborne. He wrote that medics learned to anticipate death not by vital signs, but by posture, by how a body settled when movement stopped. The nurse did not accompany flights, but she helped prepare patients for them. Her letters describe writing names and diagnoses on tags tied to wrists and boots, aware that these might be the last identifiers to remain intact. Japanese wounded were evacuated separately, often later, sometimes not at all. The medic noted this without commentary. Priority was determined by command directives, not medical assessment. He recorded cases where Japanese prisoners were deemed unfit for transport and left behind under guard, their care continuing in reduced form. The nurse did not write about this directly. Her silence is notable. Whether from censorship, fatigue, or choice, the omission leaves a gap that speaks as clearly as inclusion. As patients departed, the wards emptied unevenly. Some beds remained occupied by men considered too unstable to move. These became the focus of remaining staff. The medic described this phase as the most emotionally precarious. Attention narrowed to a small number of patients whose outcomes felt personal precisely because they could not be delegated to transport protocols. The nurse wrote about sitting beside one such patient for hours, monitoring breathing patterns more than consciousness. She did not describe him beyond that. Identity has become secondary to rhythm, inhale, exhale, pause. The departure of colleagues followed. Units rotated out. Faces disappeared without farewells. The medic noted that he no longer tried to track where others were going. The war had trained him to accept disappearance as a constant. The nurse wrote that she packed her belongings gradually, leaving essentials accessible until the last moment. She folded uniforms carefully, not out of habit, but because it imposed order on an experience that resisted structure. What neither writer fully articulated, but both implied, was the fear of recall. Not physically returning to Myitkyina, but mentally. The medic wrote that he avoided rereading earlier entries. He worried that memory would reorder events, attach emotions retroactively, distort what had been endured simply to make sense of it. The nurse expressed a similar hesitation. She wrote that she feared what might surface once movement stopped, once there were no immediate tasks to absorb attention. Forward motion, even into uncertainty, felt safer than reflection. Upon leaving Myitkyina, neither described relief. The medic wrote that the jungle receded slowly from view, but did not loosen its grip. He noted that the smell of rot lingered in clothing long after departure. The nurse wrote that she carried the sound of rain in her ears even in dry environments. These sensory remnants appeared uninvited, without warning. They were not memories so much as extensions of the place itself. The official record marked the siege as concluded. Objectives achieved. Territory secured. Supply routes established. None of this language appears in the diary or the letters. For those providing care, the campaign did not resolve into success or failure. It dissolved into dispersal. Patients moved on. Staff reassigned. Structures dismantled. What remained were fragments. Unfinished letters, truncated entries, impressions without narrative closure. The medic's final entry from Myitkyina is brief. He records the date of departure and the weather. He does not summarize his experience or reflect on its meaning. The nurse's last letter from the area ends mid-page. The remainder left blank. Whether interrupted by duty or by exhaustion is unknown. That absence functions as its own conclusion. Not an ending but a cessation. Together, these records reveal something that formal histories often overlook. The end of a battle does not arrive simultaneously for everyone involved. For those tasked with repair rather than destruction, conflict persists after objectives shift elsewhere. The siege of Myitkyina did not conclude with surrender or withdrawal. It faded unevenly through evacuation schedules, reassignment orders, and the quiet removal of suffering from the visible battlefield. When the medic and the nurse left Burma, they carried no sense of completion. Only displacement. Their writings do not attempt to extract lessons or justify cost. They preserve instead the texture of endurance, the way war lingers not as memory, but as condition. And in doing so, they record a truth rarely captured in official communiques. That survival, after prolonged exposure, is not marked by triumph, but by the ability to keep moving when nothing feels finished. The war did not follow either of them home in recognizable form. There were no recurring nightmares described, no dramatic confessions of trauma, no sudden collapses into grief. Instead, both records suggest something colder and more persistent. A gradual dulling of reaction, a recalibration of what counted as urgency. The British medic returned to civilian medical training in late 1945. His diary entries from that period grow sparse, almost skeletal. Dates appear without commentary. Locations are noted without description. Patients are reduced to initials. It is not avoidance in the dramatic sense. It is compression. The habit of recording had been shaped by scarcity, of time, of light, of paper, of emotional margin, and that habit did not disappear when the war ended. He continued to write as though interruption were always imminent. The American nurse's letters ceased entirely within months of her return. There is no final statement, no explanation. The correspondence simply stops. Family members later recalled that she spoke rarely about Burma, and when she did, she framed it clinically. She described heat, logistics, staffing shortages. She did not describe people. The letters that survived were preserved not because she intended them to be read later, but because someone else recognized their weight when she did not. In that sense, the archive exists by accident, not design. What becomes clear when these documents are read together is that neither writer experienced the siege of Myitkyina as a discrete episode. It did not begin with deployment or end with departure. It existed instead as a condition that reshaped how they interpreted human limits. The medic wrote, years later, that civilian injuries felt strangely incomplete. They followed rules. They progressed along timelines. They resolved. In Burma, wounds did not resolve. They plateaued, deteriorated, stabilized briefly, then collapsed again. Recovery was provisional. Survival is temporary. That logic lingered long after he no longer needed it. The nurse's silence after the war can be read the same way. Her letters from Myitkyina demonstrate clarity and precision, not emotional confusion. She knew exactly what she was witnessing. What appears later is not repression, but redundancy. Words had already been spent where they mattered most. To continue writing afterward may have felt unnecessary, even false. The war had taught her that articulation was a tool, not a release. Once the task changed, the tool was set aside. Decades passed before either record was revisited. The medic's diary remained in a drawer, moved between houses, occasionally nearly discarded. It was rediscovered during an estate inventory, mistaken at first for routine notes. Only when entries referencing Myitkyina were cross-checked against operational timelines did their significance become apparent. The nurse's letters were found bundled with unrelated correspondence, their envelopes still bearing censor marks. No attempt had been made to organize them. They existed as fragments, not as a narrative. What is striking is how little hindsight intrudes when these writings are read now. There is no retrospective clarity, no moral framing imposed later. Neither writer anticipated how the war would be remembered. They did not align their observations with eventual outcomes or victory narratives. Their focus remained local, immediate, and unresolved. The medic did not know that Myitkyina would later be cited as a logistical turning point in the Burma Campaign. The nurse did not know that the airfield would become shorthand for Allied persistence in terrain once deemed impassable. Their records do not contain foresight. They contain presence. This absence of narrative ambition is precisely what gives the documents their authority. They do not seek meaning. They record conditions. When the medic notes that certain patients survive transport only to die days later, he does not frame this as tragedy or irony. It is presented as a sequence. When the nurse describes writing multiple letters for men who could no longer hold a pen, she does not dwell on sentiment. She notes handwriting legibility, spelling accuracy, and whether addresses were complete. These details resist abstraction. They anchor the experience in function. In formal histories, Myitkyina is often discussed in terms of supply routes, airlift capacity, and strategic access to China. The human aftermath is condensed into casualty figures and medical summaries. The diary and letters expand that compression not by adding drama, but by refusing to resolve it. They show what it meant to inhabit the space between battle and memory, between action and consequence. They document a phase of war that resists categorization. Not combat, not peace, but sustained exposure to human breakdown without the justification of immediacy. The medic eventually stopped writing altogether. There is no final entry marking that decision. The absence suggests not exhaustion, but completion of function. The diary had served its purpose when recording was necessary for orientation. When life no longer required constant situational awareness, the habit faded. The nurse never resumed correspondence of the same intensity. Those who knew her later described her as competent, reserved, precise. They did not describe her as haunted. That distinction matters. The war did not consume her. It recalibrated her. Taken together, These records challenge the assumption that the most enduring effects of war are psychological wounds that announce themselves loudly. Instead, they suggest that the deeper transformation lies in perception, in what no longer surprises, in what no longer demands explanation. After Myitkyina, suffering was not shocking to either of them. It was expected. That expectation shaped their post-war lives more than any single memory. The siege ended in August 1944. The jungle reclaimed its ground. The airfield continued to function. The war moved on. But in the diary and the letters, Myitkyina remains unfinished. Not because the story lacks an ending, but because the experience did not require one. It altered how two people moved through the world, quietly, permanently, without ceremony. These documents do not ask to be admired. They do not argue for recognition. They simply remain. And in remaining, they offer something rare. A record of war not as climax, but as duration. Not as an event, but as a condition. What happened after the siege of Myitkyina was not resolved. It was a continuation of care, of fatigue, of attention, long after the front line disappeared from view. What ultimately survives of Myitkyina is not the battle itself, but the residue it left behind in people whose names never appeared in communiques. The diary and the letters do not resolve into lessons, nor do they culminate in redemption or clarity. They simply stop, one tapering into logistical shorthand, the other vanishing entirely. That ending is not a flaw. That is the point. War did not conclude for them with surrender documents or victory parades. It concluded when the conditions that required constant witnessing finally dissolved. In official histories, the siege is described as a necessary hardship, a cost paid to reopen a supply route and tighten pressure on Japanese forces in Burma. In these documents, it is something narrower and more unforgiving. It is a place where time lost its familiar structure. Days were measured not by dates, but by how many bodies could still be stabilized before dusk. Nights were not for rest, but for recalculating whether the morning would bring aircraft, rain, or another influx of wounded. There was no dramatic turning point where hope returned. There was only attrition, managed carefully enough to prevent collapse. Neither the British medic nor the American nurse framed what they did as extraordinary. They wrote as professionals operating inside failure margins that never fully closed. Their competence did not defeat the environment. It merely kept people alive long enough to matter for one more hour, one more letter, one more flight out. That kind of endurance leaves little room for reflection in the moment, and even less afterward. Reflection requires distance. What Myitkyina denied them was distance. When these writings are read today, they resist emotional crescendo. They do not beg for sympathy. They do not instruct the reader on how to feel. Instead, they create a quiet pressure, the sense that something essential is being conveyed precisely because it is not emphasized. The medic's sparse annotations and the nurse's procedural letters form a record of restraint under conditions designed to break it. They show how care persisted without expectation of reward, how responsibility continued even when outcome felt provisional. The siege ended. The airfield remained operational. The campaign advanced. Yet what these documents preserve is the interval in between, when success was not yet visible and failure had not yet been acknowledged. That interval is where most of the war was actually lived. Not in moments of triumph or catastrophe, but in sustained effort applied without certainty that it would be enough. This is what happened after the siege of Myitkyina. There was no catharsis, no clear demarcation between before and after. There was only a return to ordinary life by people who no longer experienced ordinary in the same way. Their records do not explain that change. They embody it. And because of that, they remain among the most reliable witnesses the war produced.